In 1973, Bob Lambeck arrived at Orange County International Raceway with a problem he had never needed to solve before. For most of his career, he had been a four-speed driver. His left foot lived on a clutch, working through every gear change as naturally as his hands worked the shifter. But now the car carried a planetary transmission, and once it left the starting line, there was no clutch pedal to use to stop himself from reaching instinctively for a pedal. That no longer mattered. Lambeck developed a new habit. During the run, he tucked his left foot beneath the seat. The new transmission was working. Lambeck sat in the number 1 qualifying position at a track that stood near the center of the Southern California pro stock world. Then the car crashed. The habit he had invented to adapt to the transmission suddenly became disastrous. His left foot was trapped beneath the seat, and the impact shattered his leg badly enough that he would walk with a cane for years. Nearly everyone who mattered in pro stock was there to see it. Bill, Jenkins, Dick Landy, Ronnie Sox, and the rest of the elite had watched Lambeck become the quickest qualifier. Then they watched the accident that ended his career as a pro stock driver. If that were the entire story, Lambeck might be remembered mainly for the crash. But the accident matters precisely because of everything that came before it, and because of everything he managed to accomplish afterward. To understand that career, the clock has to be turned back more than a decade to the industrial orbit of Detroit. Bob Lambeck was born in January 1941 in Belleville, Michigan, roughly 20 miles southwest of Detroit. Growing up there during the 1950s meant living close to the center of the American automobile industry. Engines were not merely machines that moved people from one place to another. Cars, horsepower, engineering, and mechanical competition were embedded in the culture. Eventually, Lambeck moved west to Southern California, where his drag racing career took shape in earnest. He established himself in the San Fernando Valley and later operated Bob Lambeck Enterprises at 8810 Yolanda Avenue in Northridge. Over time, the shop became a respected West Coast engine building operation. One of the first national results in his record came at the 1963 Winter Nationals at Pomona. Driving a 1962 Pontiac Stalker, Lambeck won his class. At the time, the sport was still organized around complicated landscape of production-based categories and handicap racing. Lambeck spent the middle of the 1960s competing successfully throughout NHRA Division 7, racing in California, Nevada, and the surrounding region. By 1967, the results had become impossible to dismiss. That season, Lambeck drove a 4-speed 1957 Chevrolet in G/stock and captured the Division 7 championship. The class system was based on weight per cubic inch formulas, placing production-derived cars into categories intended to create comparable competition. A divisional title, therefore, represented more than one good weekend. It required consistent performance across a regional season. At the 1967 World Finals in Tulsa, Oklahoma, another important development occurred. This performance attracted the attention of Jerry Gross, a representative of Chrysler's racing program. That conversation redirected Lambeck's career. The timing could hardly have been better because drag racing itself was about to change. In 1967 and 1968, Superstock remained tied to handicap competition. Cars were classified through weight-to-power formulas, and races were not always simple first-to-the-finish-line contests. The driver could know that his car was genuinely quicker than the machine in the other lane, and still compete within a system that obscured that difference. Outside the formal NHRA structure, however, another version of the sport was thriving. Match racing offered something much easier to understand. Recognizable cars, famous drivers, and heads-up competition. Ronnie Sox, Dick Landy, Bill Jenkins, Don Nicholson, and other factory stars could earn $1,000 or more simply for appearing at regional tracks and making a few runs against local favorites. Fans responded because the premise required no explanation. Two cars staged. They left together. The first one to the finish line won. In effect, the factory teams were already operating a professional circuit alongside the official structure. The project began in November 1967 when Chrysler engineer Bob Tarazzi started developing what became a 1968 BO-29 Plymouth Barracuda and LO-23 Dodge Darts Superstock program. Chrysler sent partially assembled A-body Darts and Barracudas to Hearst Performance in Ferndale, Michigan, where they were converted from production shells into specialized drag cars. Weight reduction was pursued aggressively. Fiberglass replaced steel in the hood, trumped lid, and fenders. Chemically thin glass reduced mass. Further, lightweight Bostrom A100 seats replaced ordinary production seating, and the interiors were stripped to the essentials. Under the hood sat the centerpiece, a 426 race Hemi equipped with a cross-ram aluminum intake, two 735 CFM Holley 4-barrel carburetors, headers, and a Dana 60 rear axle carrying 4.86 gears. Officially, the engine was rated at 425 horsepower. In properly prepared race trim, the real output was far higher, well beyond 600 horsepower. According to the source material, the cars could run in the 10.3 second range almost immediately. Contemporary Ford 428 Cobra jet combinations were around 11.5 seconds, with SS/E machinery roughly a full second slower. Approximately 80 LO-23 Darts were built. Estimates for BO-29 Barracuda production vary by source, generally falling somewhere between 50 and 70. Ronnie Sox received one, and the Sox and Martin Barracuda became one of the best-known examples. Dick Landy received two LO-23 Darts, one automatic and one 4-speed. Other cars went to racers including Herb McCandless, Arlen Vank, Billy Stett, and Bob Reed, whose Barracuda survived and was later restored. These were not ordinary showroom cars with a few racing parts added. They were purpose-built factory weapons. And in 1968, Jerry Gross helped connect Lambeck with Dick Landy. That partnership changed Lambeck's role. He was no longer limited to racing his own equipment. Landy was operating a large factory-backed program and, at his busiest, could manage as many as 7 race cars in a season across several classes and drivers. He needed someone capable of winning in the cars Landy could not personally drive. At the 1968 Winter Nationals, he was still campaigning his 1957 Chevrolet and continued winning class, including a victory over Frank Iacono, who would later establish his own reputation in pro stock. But the larger program centered on Landy's 440-power Dodge Dart GTN SS/EA, the automatic transmission Superstock E category. That car also introduced another technical element into Lambeck's story, a B&M high-stall torque converter. The converter allowed the engine to reach higher RPM before coupling more firmly, helping the car leave harder while managing traction. Lambeck's results with the combination were strong enough that B&M used him in an advertisement in the October 1969 issue of Superstock and Drag Illustrated. Lambeck won the NHRA Division 7 Superstock Championship. According to the source, he accumulated more points than any other divisional champion in any class that year. That distinction deserves more attention than it usually receives. Drag racing was moving rapidly from a regional structure toward more nationally visible professional sport, and Lambeck had produced the highest championship points total across every class and division. In 1969, Lambeck captured another Division 7 Superstock Championship, this time driving Landy's 1969 Dodge Super B in SS/E. At the Winter Nationals, he won his class with an 11.48 second pass at 106.88 miles per hour. At the end of the season, he finished second nationally in Superstock, only 100 points behind Ed Terry's Ford Cobra Jet. He was no longer simply a successful regional racer. He was operating near the top of one of drag racing's most competitive factory categories. On 1969, the best factory drivers had spent years proving that. Spectators wanted heads-up racing. The match race circuit had already demonstrated the commercial value of straightforward competition between recognizable cars and personalities. The United Drag Racers Association had established a professional heads-up division in 1967, and similar racing appeared at other events. NHRA founder Wally Parks, however, had publicly resisted the idea of a heads-up stock category. In an October 1969 Motor Trend interview cited by the source, he dismissed the concept as disconnected from actual production automobiles. At the 1969 U.S. Nationals in Indianapolis, Ronnie Sox, Dick Landy, Bill Jenkins, and Don Nicholson confronted Parks with a choice: create a professional heads-up stock class or risk losing the leading super stock teams to a rival organization. On October 31st, 1969, NHRA announced Pro Stock in National Dragster. The class Parks had resisted would debut at the 1970 Winter Nationals. His position inside Dick Landy's operation placed him directly in the first generation of Pro Stock competition. Yet even the leading factory teams were still learning what the new category required. For the inaugural event, Landy put Lambeck in a car equipped with a clutch flight automatic transmission. It was an odd fit. Lambeck had spent years proving himself with a 4-speed. He understood manual transmissions, knew how to shift them under pressure, and had already won at national events with that style of driving. Landy apparently viewed the automatic as the more sensible option for a new car in a new class. Lambeck did not share that enthusiasm after trying it. He later described the clutch flight as essentially useless for what he needed. After the first event, Landy told him to remove it, throw it away, and replace it with a 4-speed. The episode reveals how factory teams actually functioned. Lambeck was a trusted driver, but he was still driving Landy's equipment according to Landy's decisions. When the experiment failed, they adapted. It also illustrates how unsettled early pro stock remained. Even elite teams were discovering basic combinations through competition. During 1970, he captured the NHRA Division 6 Pro Stock Championship while driving a Dart. At the same time, he won the Division 7 Super Stock Championship. In Pro Stock's first season, he was simultaneously winning divisional titles in the new professional category and the older class from which it had evolved. Then the financial structure underneath factory drag racing began to collapse. Chrysler reduced its racing budget as the manufacturer wars of the late 1960s faded. By the end of 1970, factory money was disappearing, and Lambeck had to continue without the support structure that had helped carry the sport through the previous era. Lambeck located a 1968 Hemi Dodge Dart that had been competing in super stock and had ended up in Oklahoma. Its engine had been built by Don Grethier, who had won a super stock class at the 1969 Winter Nationals. In his own BO-29 Barracuda, Lambeck bought the entire Dart for $2,200. For that amount, he acquired a purpose-built Hemi race car carrying an engine with legitimate national event pedigree, a revealing snapshot of what happened to specialized factory race machinery once manufacturer support began retreating. He brought the car to chassis builder Ron Butler in the Los Angeles area. Butler was already deeply involved in serious Mopar pro stock work and had built cars for racers including Butch Leal and Bill Backshaw. The combination gave Lambeck what he needed. For 1971, he won West Coast pro stock races as an independent, without the factory resources or large team infrastructure available to operations such as Jenkins or Sox and Martin. On 1972, Butler had constructed a Plymouth Duster Pro Stock car for him. Weight rules placed Hemi-powered Chrysler combinations at a substantial disadvantage against small block Chevrolets and Boss Ford engines. In some configurations, the difference exceeded 200 pounds. In a drag car, 200 pounds is not a minor inconvenience. It is a structural performance penalty, one that tuning alone cannot simply erase. There, he raced Larry Huff, who had switched to a planetary transmission. Lambeck watched the advantage repeat itself year after year. Each time Huff shifted, he appeared to gain roughly half a car length. A planetary transmission allowed the driver to pre-select and engage ratios through levers rather than operating a conventional clutch for every shift. Properly set up, the system could produce quicker and more repeatable changes. Lambeck had resisted abandoning the 4-speed. It was the equipment he knew, and changing a proven race car always introduced another opportunity for something to fail. The next day, Lambeck ordered a planetary transmission. At Fremont, on his first outing with a new setup, he qualified number 1 to prevent his left foot from searching for the absent clutch during the run. He had trained himself to tuck it under the seat. When the car crashed, that adaptation became the source of a devastating injury. His leg was trapped and broken severely. He would need a cane for years. Jenkins, Landy, Sox, and the rest of the Pro Stock elite were there. And Lambeck never again drove a Pro Stock car. What he might have accomplished as a driver is impossible to calculate. He had already demonstrated that he could run at the front, and the new transmission was working. The Mopar weight disadvantage remained, but so did Lambeck's ability. Instead, he shifted his attention toward the other skill that had always been central to his success: building engines and preparing cars for other drivers. During the middle of the 1970s, Chrysler approached Lambeck about returning to stock eliminator competition using direct connection components. Direct connection was the company's factory performance parts program, and Chrysler wanted successful racers, demonstrating what those parts could accomplish. Lambeck built Extrend, a yellow duster powered by a low compression 360 cubic inch engine for stock eliminator. Extrend won the 1975 NHRA World Finals and became the 1975 stock eliminator world champion. It was the first world championship earned by a Lambeck-built car. Afterward, Lambeck constructed an identical red duster for Extrend and retained the yellow car himself. At the same time, another program was developing around a Hemi-powered Plymouth Barracuda. The available material confirms that Lambeck raced a Hemi Barracuda in A/modified production and SS/DA. It also confirms major class victories. The car won class of the 1976 and 1977 Winter Nationals and of the 1976 and 1977 NHRA U.S. Nationals. That is 4 major national event class wins across 2 consecutive seasons. In 1977, Chrysler's Direct Connection program also featured the Barracuda in advertising, evidence that the company regarded the car as a strong demonstration of its performance components. What the available documentation does not establish conclusively is the Barracuda's model year. Sources identify it as a Hemi Barracuda or Plymouth Barracuda, but the material used for this account does not definitively label it as a 1968 car. One intriguing possibility is that Lambeck's car originated as one of the BO-29 factory superstock Barracudas built for 1968. Only somewhere between 50 and 70 of those cars were produced. According to the estimates cited earlier, by the middle of the 1970s, many had passed through several owners as factory programs ended and racing categories changed. By then, Chrysler's original factory effort was long finished, and former factory race cars had dispersed into private hands. Lambeck's extensive Mopar network would certainly have made acquiring one possible, but Novin establishing that provenance appears in the material used here, and no period feature located for the source definitively identifies the car's origin. Modified production had existed since the early 1960s and permitted production body cars with engine combinations that departed from stock specifications. After Pro Stock emerged, modified production became an important home for serious racers who either could not finance a leading Pro Stock effort or own machinery that no longer fit the rapidly evolving Pro Stock formula. A Hemi Barracuda in a/modified production using a direct, connection-oriented engine program was therefore not an irrelevant leftover. Winning class at Pomona and Indianapolis in consecutive years made the program more than a historical curiosity. Instead of openly financing teams in the old style, Chrysler could sell performance components through direct connection and promote racers who won with them. Lambeck's Barracuda fit that strategy perfectly. He was no longer functioning as a paid factory driver, but the relationship between his racing operation and Chrysler performance remained alive. By the end of the decade, that relationship contributed to another important chapter. Lambeck began working with driver Randy Humphrey on a 1978 Plymouth Volare Pro Stock car powered by second-generation 426 Hemi. They took the car onto the National Pro Stock circuit in 1979. The timing placed them directly against Bob Glidden during one of the most dominant stretches in class history. Glidden had won 9 consecutive national events and reached 17 straight final rounds. At the Mile High Nationals in Denver, Randy Humphrey met him in the semifinal. Glidden red-lighted. Humphrey advanced to the final and defeated Sonny Bryant 9.27 to 9.31. Lambeck's own competitive record continued into the 1980s. In 1983, he drove to the NHRA Winter Nationals Stock Eliminator title. At the 1984 and 1985 U.S. Nationals, he won class in a small block Plymouth Duster. In a 1985, Tim Ekstrom captured another Stock Eliminator World Championship in a Lambeck car. A decade after their first title together, Lambeck had become a 2-time World Championship car owner. His son Doug entered the sport and developed into one of the country's most accomplished competition eliminator and stock racers. As of 2020, the source credits Doug with 16 national event victories. Lambeck's grandson, Austin, continued the line into a third generation. Bob Lambeck died on April 25, 2025, at the age of 84. His official obituary described him as a Southern California door slammer, legend, a pro stock pioneer, a multiple divisional champion, and a 2-time world championship car owner. Yet taken together, they still fail to capture the most interesting part of his career. When G/stock mattered, he was a champion there. When a factory superstock wars reached their height, he became a superstock champion. When Pro Stock was created, he was in a field during its inaugural season. When modified production became a competitive home for machinery, displaced by the new professional order, Lambeck won national event classes with a Hemi Barracuda. When his driving career in Pro Stock ended, he built engines and fielded cars capable of winning championships for other people. That kind of career is easy to overlook because it does not fit neatly into a single famous era. Ronnie Sox received magazine covers, retrospectives, and enduring recognition. Bill Jenkins became inseparable from the grumpy identity and from decades of technical analysis. Dick Landy had factory support, a distinctive public persona, a nickname, and a prominent place in documentaries. Lambeck's career was different. He could score more points than any divisional champion in any class in 1968 and still occupy far less space in popular drag racing history. Motorsports often remembers its flamboyant pioneers more easily than the working competitors who appeared every week, adapted to new rules, mastered new categories, built engines for other champions, and kept winning without the largest factory operation behind them. His Hemi Barracuda from 1976 and 1977 is a particularly useful symbol of that transitional career, not because the car's exact provenance can be claimed with certainty, but because of what its documented results represent. By then, Pro Stock had already moved away from the machinery that defined the late 1960s factory wars. Major operations were increasingly dependent on specialized engines, purpose-built chassis, larger budgets, and stronger sponsor support. Yet Lambeck was still winning national event classes in A. Production-bodied, Hemi-powered Barracuda, and appearing in direct connection advertising as evidence that the older Chrysler Performance formula remained effective. The car, its Hemi engine program, Lambeck's earlier connection to Dick, Landy, and a later direct connection relationship tie the program to a chain stretching from a 1968 factory wars through the birth of Pro stock, independent years that followed, and finally into the more corporate form of professional drag racing. Lambeck crossed every one of those eras without becoming the headline. For decades, Bob Lambeck Enterprises operated in Northridge. Cars prepared by Lambeck won world championships. Cars he drove won national events. His family continued racing into a third generation. That is why the 1973 crash at Orange County should not be remembered simply as the day Bob Lambeck stopped driving pro stock. Before the crash, he had risen from stock and super stock into the first generation of pro stock, adapting repeatedly as drag racing reinvented itself around him. After the crash, he redirected the same mechanical knowledge into engines, race cars, national event victories, record-setting pro stock, machinery, and championship-winning programs for other drivers. The most visible names in a sport are not always the people whose careers explain it best. Bob Lambeck's does.